Part 3. War Footing. 11.
Thanks for the intel. That's pretty concerning, but only goes to show we're doing the right thing by increasing security.
Randall paced his office as Luke and Isaac drank the coffee that Becky had brought in.
"So you think maybe it was a forward team of this New America?"
asked Isaac.
Well, the casing you found indicates they had at least one high-powered rifle, the older man said, sitting down. If it was a random loner, they sure chose an interesting spot to camp out and take a pot shot. It may well be unrelated to New America, but we should assume the worst case here. If I put myself in their shoes, I'd be sending out a team or teams to assess us just like I did them. If they did get information from my missing team, it means they know we're big and well-armed.
What do you think they were doing in Manchester, then? asked Luke. Randall shrugged.
I'm pretty sure if they were scoping you out, they've scoped out Concord, too. Maybe they've seen the comings and goings. From the outside looking in, it might even appear that we're a part of the same group expanding over 2 cities. Perhaps it's time to come to an agreement, he said, nailing Isaac with a look.
What sort of agreement?
Well, you know I'm not interested in expansion, but I would be willing to station a contingent of men in Manchester on a semi-permanent basis, at least until this all blows over. It's in both our interests to have a strong ally close by.
I think we'd be open to that. We'll need to put it to the council, of course. How many men are we talking?
10% of my force, 50 men. They can blockade the bridges and roads from the south and patrol anywhere you think you need.
Wow, you have my vote, Luke said to Isaac. Pretty sure there won't be a problem getting a unanimous vote. Everybody was pretty shaken up.
Yeah. All right, that's settled then. I'll begin the preparations. You just get a message to me when you've cleared it with your council, and we'll get to it. I'll see you out.
Yes, sir.
They followed Randall out.
Bye, Luke,
said Becky with a smile. Bye. He responded as nonchalantly as he could, knowing full well the heat in his cheeks was a giveaway.
That Becky girl seems nice,
said Isaac as they passed through the final checkpoint and began following the road back to Manchester. Are you fishing, dude?
Are the fish biting?
Luke folded his hands over his chest. Nope.
To tell the truth, I think she likes you.
Dude, just drive. The truth was, he liked Becky, and it was pretty obvious the feeling was reciprocated. He wondered if she knew he was a dad and if that would make a difference to her feelings. Anyway, it just seemed way too soon to be thinking about another woman. On the morning of the second day after the errant shot by Giuliano, Eshman waited in General Orton's outer office. The drive back to Albany had taken nearly 9 hours, and they'd stayed for the night there before heading on to Rochester at dawn. He imagined that in the old days it would have been possible to travel between Manchester and Rochester in about 6 hours. While the roads in New York State had been pretty much cleared by Riley's people, they'd had to stop frequently on the country roads of New Hampshire and Vermont to move obstructions like fallen trees and dead vehicles. The intercom on the receptionist's desk buzzed.
"Send him in."
"Yes, sir," said his receptionist, a big guy who no doubt had 2 roles to play for his boss. He looked across to Eshman. "You can go in."
"Morning, Eshman,"
said William Orton. Despite the early hour, he looked fresh and his gaze was sharp.
"Morning, sir."
"Sit down and spill."
"Yes, sir."
Eshman pulled a notepad from his pocket and proceeded to tell his general everything they'd learned, day by day, in the month they'd been out. Orton made notes, asking a pertinent question here and there. He didn't show surprise at any of the facts and figures, but Eshman knew he must have been at the very least a little shocked. In fact, the only time he showed any real emotion was when Eshman got up to the final day in his notes and explained what had happened on the roof.
"What were my orders?"
he said in a low voice. Eshman would have preferred shouting.
"Not to engage, sir."
"And yet—"
"Look, sir, the kid is young. Maybe it was my fault for putting him on the roof.
You're right, it is your fault. He leaned over the intercom and stabbed the button with his finger. Golding, have the MPs come and escort Mr. Eshman to the square. Turn out the barracks. There's going to be a whipping in 30 minutes. Eshman's face went white. Yes, sir. Oh, and make sure that Eshman's team is front and center. He sat back and looked at Eshman. Do you have something to say? Eshman didn't want to be whipped. It wasn't only about the pain. It was more the humiliation, but he knew if he argued it would probably only make matters worse. No, sir. I didn't think so. Exactly 30 minutes later, Eshman, stripped to the waist, was tied to a post in front of the Brown house. The post was on a rude concrete stage that had been constructed for just this purpose, making examples of people who had done the wrong thing. Usually it was floggings, but just occasionally an execution for the worst crimes. The entire barracks had gathered around, and civilians had also begun assembling as news of the flogging spread. Eshman eyed his team, noting that they all gave him nods of support. All but Giuliano, who stared at his feet. He caught movement in his peripheral vision and raised his head towards the roof of the Brown house. On the roof, a small group of people was watching. Eshman spotted the tall figure of the president watching silently amongst the other watchers, who appeared to be talking animatedly. The crowd at the foot of the stage parted to allow a big, bald guy carrying a bullwhip through. He wore a black tank top, with khaki pants tucked into his boots. The crowd started to chant, "Bull, Bull, Bull." The name was apt. General Orton's multi-purpose strongman was tall with massive shoulders and a neck as wide as his big head. He was feared and adored in equal parts by the public, and hated by the soldiers for his ruthlessness and favored position. It was a silent hatred, though. No one dared voice their opinion to the general, and most definitely not to Bull. He had snapped the neck of the last soldier too drunk and stupid to know better. Bull was followed onto the stage by William Orton, looking resplendent in his black uniform. Eshman briefly wondered if he'd found it in a costume shop. It looked a little like a cross between the uniform of a Death Star commander and a German SS uniform. Orton turned on the stage and raised his hands. His blond hair blew in the wind as the crowd slowly hushed. "Friends, soldiers of New America," he called in a loud voice, "we are gathered to see punishment. A punishment earned for disobeying a direct order. 5 lashes of Bull's whip. Let this be a lesson to all." For once, Eshman wished that Orton had had a longer speech prepared. Then again, maybe not. Perhaps the anticipation was worse than the actual punishment. Orton stepped back, and Bull, the same man who had recently tortured the captured soldier from Concord, theatrically walked to the back of the stage and held his hands wide, allowing the length of the whip to fall and slap the concrete. The chant went up again. "Bull, Bull, Bull." Eshman allowed himself to flop against the pole and looked down into the first row. Giuliano met his gaze this time, and Eshman thought he saw at least 2 emotions: guilt and relief. Bull held up his left hand and jabbed a meaty finger into the sky as he began to heft the handle of the whip in his right hand. "One!" called the crowd. Crack! The pain was excruciating. Eshman felt like someone had drawn a line of gasoline across his shoulder blades and lit it with a match. 2! Crack! 3! Crack! He blacked out, but the reprieve was short-lived. He came to, slumped against the pole, unable to straighten his legs. 5! Crack! The 5th stroke was like a punch. His whole back was aflame with agony, and he only felt the physical impact. The burning didn't get any worse. Eshman gave up trying to stand and slid down the pole as far as the ropes around his wrist would allow. The crowd roared its approval. "Bull! Bull! Bull!" Orton stepped up to the edge of the stage again and held up his hands. "The punishment has been served," he said, gesturing to the bleeding, slumped form of Eshman. "Let this be a lesson. Some mistakes will be tolerated and discipline meted out. Other mistakes will not be tolerated." With that, he stepped up to the edge of the stage and produced the small handgun he'd been holding behind his back. Now there were screams from the crowd as they shrunk back in horror. Eshman barely registered surprise, though. He was in a state of shock and didn't react when Orton shot Bruno Giuliano between the eyes. He passed out again as Giuliano fell at the feet of his team, a look of surprise on his face. 12. An hour later, Orton was in President Riley's office, sharing the intel Eshman's team had gathered from their mission into New Hampshire. "So it's confirmed then," said Riley. "2 cities, a combined population of around 1,000, and an army of at least 500. It doesn't sound like they'll have a choice but to capitulate, given we outnumber them by at least 3 times. I think it's time we send an envoy." "For that reason, I think we should take them by surprise," said Orton. "If we send an envoy, we give them a warning and a chance to gather themselves to defend. This is former military we're talking about, and I don't think their leaders will surrender." "Yes, we outnumber them," said Riley. "But remember, we'll be on their turf, and they have battle-hardened soldiers, real soldiers, U.S. Army soldiers from before the attack. They'll be well-armed and disciplined, not like the scrappy gangs of toothless kids we've been knocking over." "It will be a challenge, Mr. President, but I think we must take decisive action." Riley waved his hand. "Go on. What do you suggest, then?" "No attack. Not at first, anyway. We should roll our entire army up on their doorstep, then parley with them. Give them the same opportunity you give everyone else we conquer." He stood up and leaned over the map of the eastern United States on the table between them. He ran his finger from Rochester directly east across the map until it stopped just to the west of Concord. "I think we should send 3,000 men to this point, with me in command. Meanwhile, we send 250 men led by Cyclops to secure Manchester. We make both cities the offer. Submit and become the most eastern outpost of New America or die. Faced with our larger forces, this colonel should see sense." "Go on," said Riley, his face thoughtful. "We'll send the contingent of 250 from Albany. They can head south and then curl north back up to Manchester. Eshman's team had to return before they had hard numbers, but based on what they saw, he didn't think there could be more than 500 souls there, and at least half would be women and children. That would leave roughly 300 soldiers to cover a worst-case scenario to protect our border." Riley steepled his fingers and stared into the distance. Orton waited patiently, aware of his leader's penchant for the theatrical. The seconds stretched into a minute, and finally Orton cleared his throat. Riley put his hands flat on the table and looked at Orton with an intensity rare even for him. "This is what we'll do. I will lead the army. All 3 tanks and 100 cavalrymen east to Concord. You'll be by my side. We'll send the entire Albany division of 500 to Manchester. If they decide to fight, Manchester will be crushed quickly as we attack Concord with our main force. Then Cyclops and his men can come up on Concord from behind to mop things up. It'll be over in less than a day if it comes to a fight." William held his tongue. He wanted to argue that it was dangerous to show their full hand, but the glint in Riley's eyes was a dangerous one. Aidan Riley saw his doubt. "Have I ever told you what happened to me when we were evacuated from the White House, Will?" "Only that you managed to escape the Chinese when they killed the team assigned to protect you and your mother." "Yes. I ran alone through the woods because my Secret Service man was injured.
He sacrificed himself to lead them away from me. I thought it had worked. It hadn't. Not long after, a lone Chinese soldier had stumbled upon me. It was comical, really. We were both as surprised as each other when it happened. Anyway, his surprise wore off, and he was quicker than me. He ordered me to put up my hands. Then his head exploded. He was blasted by a man hiding out in an ambush with his 2 sons. They were preppers, armed to the teeth and fighting for their country guerrilla style. They killed the rest of the Chinese pursuing me in an ambush. Lucky me, right?
Sure, said Orton, unsure where this conversation was heading, only knowing it was making him uncomfortable.
Wrong! You see, the old man got killed as he was about to plug the leader of the Chinese. The boys took me. I'd been saved from the Chinese, but now was held captive by 2 sons mourning their father and blaming me for his death. When they found out who I was, it got worse, not better. Sorry. Nothing for you to be sorry about, Will. They kept me in their basement for over a year. They fed me every few days and would bring down kids they'd met and recruited to show me off as a sign of their power. They pretty much had a house full of survivors and had trained them into quite a little force by the end of that 12 months. I don't need to tell you some of the things they did to me down there. You would probably guess what 2 angry, out-of-control teenagers could do to someone they perceived to be the cause of all their problems. But do you know how I turned it around? No, sir, said William quietly. I overwhelmed them, William. I got loose one morning while they were out hunting. I found a hammer in an old toolbox, and I waited for them to come down for their nightly party. It was usually after everyone else had gone to bed. I was skinny and in pretty poor shape, but I was desperate, and they were complacent. I clubbed those boys into submission with that hammer. They begged for mercy, and I gave it to them. The same mercy they'd shown me. I beat those boys until their heads were nothing but puddles on the ground.
William felt a jolt of fear. No stranger to inflicting violence himself, the cold way Riley told the story hammered home why he was such a dangerous man. A product of his circumstances, no doubt, but how he got to be that way was a moot point. I lead. I show the people of Concord our full strength, and if they refuse the deal, we overwhelm them. That will be easier if I have every fighting man and woman in New America at their doorstep. Yes, sir. Good. See to the preparations. How long? 4 weeks. That will give me enough time to prepare, and we can make our move early October. Riley looked as though he might argue, but in the end, waved vaguely at Orton. Fine. Get to it. Yes, sir, said Orton, standing up and starting for the door. Oh, and William, said President Riley, as his general reached for the door handle, don't shoot any more of my men without a trial. If we're to maintain law and order, we need to be showing the people that we are just. I don't want to have to sacrifice you to do that. Understand? Yes, sir, said Orton without turning around. He went through the doors, seething. You little fuck. If it weren't for me, you wouldn't have people. By the time he got back to his office in the old police headquarters, he had calmed down. He poured himself a shot of whiskey and sipped at it, allowing the liquid to burn his mouth before swallowing it and pouring another. Perhaps it's time for a change of leadership, he said quietly. A plan began to formulate in his mind. 13. It's that one there, said Luke, gesturing to the house where he'd found the Mustang. Paul pulled the Jeep in front of the abandoned home and switched the motor off. It was a bright, sunny morning on the last day of September, and 3 weeks since the shot that had been fired at Diana and Ben. While everyone had been in a heightened state of alert initially, the passing days and an extended period of hot weather meant that for most of the people of Manchester, things had pretty much gone back to business as usual, apart from the presence of the encampment of soldiers in the old U.S. Army facility just down the road. In fact, life was good. They had power, running water, and sewer in the tower. They were now, in fact, more comfortable than they'd been back at the farm. That morning, Luke had decided to recruit Paul and Jamal to help him try and wake the '69 Mustang from its long hibernation. Once out of the Jeep, Luke strode down the driveway to the garage door. Standing behind him, Jamal and Paul looked on curiously as he pulled up the door. Dust motes played in the rays of sunshine as Luke looked around the enclosed space. Everything was just as he'd left it. The Mustang was still under its cover and dominating the room. The locker door that he'd taken the motorcycle leathers from was still open. A strange emotion washed over him. It wasn't sadness, exactly, more an echo of the mourning he'd done in the house on the first few nights of his self-imposed banishment. "Well, let's see it," said Paul eagerly. "Okay, sure." Luke stepped up to the car and gripped the front corner of the cover and hoisted it. He pulled it up and over the hood with a flourish before dragging it back over the roof and the rest of the body. Both Paul and Jamal made genuine noises of approval. "Wow, she's a beauty," said Paul, running his hand over the gentle curve of the right fender. "I know, right?" said Luke. "Are you sure you'll be able to start it?" "I think so," said Jamal. "You have a key, though, right?" "Yeah, I left it on the passenger seat." "Okay, pop the hood." Luke climbed in behind the wheel and pulled the lever. With a click and a springy sound, the latch released. Jamal reached under and unclasped the latch before lifting it and revealing the engine. "Well, the good news is, it has a motor," said Jamal. Luke and Paul laughed. Jamal was a serious guy and hardly ever joked, apparently seeing the V8 American-made muscle had put him in a good mood. "Okay, I'll need my toolbox and the battery. We'll get that done first, then put the gasoline in." Paul and Luke grabbed the battery and tools as Jamal looked over the engine. "What if it's already got gas?" asked Paul when he put the battery down on the floor. "Well, hopefully they never used an ethanol blend. It's bad for seals and fuel lines and can cause rust if it's left sitting. Usually someone with a car like this will look after it, so we might be in luck, especially if he used a fuel stabilizer. Again, if he wasn't using it every day, he might have." Jamal bent over and started picking tools out of the box. 10 minutes later, they had the fully charged battery in place. "Now we'll put the gas in," said Jamal, opening the fuel cap of the car. "And let the fresh stuff mingle with whatever's left in there. Probably the emptier the tank is, the better." Luke grabbed the 5-gallon jerry can of Concord refined fuel they'd been gifted by Randall's men and fitted the spout into the opening and began to pour. "I think it's pretty empty," he said, based on the splashing sound in the tank. He put the can down by the wall when he was done and looked at Jamal. "Okay, so you ready to do the honors?" said Jamal, holding out the keys. Luke took the keys. "You betcha," he said, grinning. "Drum roll, please." Luke climbed in and without any further ado turned the key. The car began to crank, but didn't fire. He turned it off and tried again. Once again it cranked without firing. Jamal opened the passenger side door. "See that button down there? It's called a choke. Just pull it out a little and try again." Luke didn't have much hope. He knew how this would go. They'd try, and it would never start. He turned it again. This time it cranked and made 2 loud pops accompanied by a puff of white smoke from the exhaust. Then it went back to the horrible cranking sound. "Give it a little more," said Jamal, indicating Luke should pull the choke a little further out. Luke turned the key again, and this time the engine roared to life, spluttering and hiccuping for 10 seconds or so until Luke tapped the accelerator. Vroom, vroom, vroom. Jamal shut the passenger door and gave Paul a high five, and they both proceeded to do a little victory dance. "Take it out onto the driveway," called Paul, stepping out of the way. Luke put the car into drive and pressed the gas. It jerked forward. "Whoa," he said before hitting the brakes and then easing his foot off, this time a little more gently. He nursed the car out onto the driveway and cranked down his window. "Come on, let's go for a spin." He didn't need to give them a second invitation. In a flash, they were in the car, Jamal in the front and Paul in the back, leaning between their seats as Luke drove around the Jeep they'd come in and headed onto the street. They spent 30 minutes or so taking turns and driving around the small neighborhood before Jamal pointed out if they didn't get it back to the tower soon, they would probably run out of gas. Okay. They headed back to the house. Jamal and Paul played rock, paper, scissors to see who would have to drive the Jeep back. Jamal won. "Did you want to drive?" Luke asked. "No, maybe another time. This is your baby, so I'm sure you'd like to be the one who rolls up to the tower behind the wheel." Luke grinned and nodded. Things only got better when he tested the horn on the way home and was rewarded by the first 12 notes of the song Dixie. "That's the same as the General Lee in the old Dukes of Hazzard show. Me and my dad used to watch the reruns." "Oh, they're going to know you're coming now," said Jamal. Once Luke was through the checkpoint manned by 4 of Randall's now very impressed men, he began hitting the horn over and over. By the time they pulled up, a sizable crowd had come out onto the steps to see what the commotion was. Isaac just shook his head in wonder as Luke and Jamal climbed out of the black and chrome beast. Paul pulled up behind them in the Jeep and rushed to join the other 2. The car was soon surrounded by a crowd, 3 people deep. Luke received lots of requests for rides, but begged off, using fuel as the excuse. The truth was, he already had an idea about who he wanted his first guest passenger of honor to be. "Do you think the Army boys will let us have another jerry can full?" he asked Jamal as they went inside. "When they get a look at that thing, I don't think it will be a problem. That'll get me to Concord, right?" "Yeah, and they have a running fuel station there. You might have to call in a favor from the colonel to get a full tank, though." "Leave it to me. I'll see what I can do." Luke spent the rest of the day with Erin. He was surprised by how quick she was developing. She could now sit on her own with only the occasional wobble, and had taken to solid food like a trooper. "She'll be crawling soon, and then you'll be in trouble," said Diana. She and Ben had come to visit. They sat holding hands on the sofa, watching Samuel playing with Erin as Luke made them a drink. He handed them each a glass of the fresh lemonade that Allie and Ava had been making every day and sat down opposite them. "Delicious as always," said Ben, smacking his lips. "I'd still like to know how they keep up a fresh supply of lemons to make this stuff." "Some deal they did with the boys, I believe," said Luke. "They found an orchard within an hour's ride, believe it or not." "Orchard might be a stretch. I heard it was a backyard full of trees behind a big old house," said Diana. "Sounds more plausible given the locale." "I'm glad you guys came by," said Luke. "I wanted to ask you something." "What is it?" asked Diana, concerned by his troubled face. I'm not sure how to say it. I'm sure we can help if it's advice you need," said Ben. "Well, it's not advice exactly," Luke said, looking at Ben. "It's more like permission, I guess." "Permission? I don't understand." I was wondering if you thought it would be okay, or if you would mind if I asked someone out on a date." A flash of pain passed over Ben's face, like a cloud across the sun. "Sorry," Luke blurted. "It's too soon, isn't it? Shit, I shouldn't have." Ben put his hands up to placate Luke. "It's fine, mate. Really, there's no designated time for these things. I'm sure Brooke—" He took a second to gather himself and wiped away a tear with his sleeve. "I'm sure she'd want you to get on with your life, for your sake and for Erin's." Luke nodded, not able to trust his voice would make it past the lump in his throat. Diana squeezed Ben's hand in support. "So, who's the lucky lady?" she asked to lighten the suddenly somber mood of the room. "Yes," said Ben. "I'm certainly curious." "It's a girl called Becky, in Concord. She works for the colonel." "Well, you'll have to introduce us." "I will, definitely. Who knows, I haven't asked her yet. She'll probably say no."
I'm sure she'll say yes to at least one date, said Diana.
Ben and Diana stayed late into the afternoon and were eventually joined by Isaac, Indigo, and Max. They were also fine with the news Luke had broken.
Let me guess,
said Isaac.
The colonel's assistant?
Luke nodded. Isaac left off his normal ribbing, understanding the sensitivity of the situation.
Well, she looks nice. I hope it goes well for you. Should we go down for dinner?
There was a chorus of agreement, and Diana made a beeline for Aaron. I'll take this little cutie pie. Ooh, Ben, watch out. Someone looks clucky. Diana laughed, but didn't deny the charge. Ben just blushed. Luke grasped his arm before they went through the door. When Ben turned, he pulled him into a tight hug. I just want to say thanks for everything you've done for Aaron and me and for, well, not being awkward about this whole dating thing. No worries, said Ben. You're a good bloke, and I know Brooke's smiling down on us. Are you ready, sir? Asked William Orton when he was led into the president's office. I am, said Riley, turning from the full-length mirror where he had been patting his hair into place. Orton had to admit Aiden Riley looked the part. Freshly shaved and wearing a blue suit with a red tie, the 21-year-old bore a striking resemblance to his father. How do I look? Presidential, sir. Good. Is the car ready? Yes. All right, let's go then. As they headed for the doors and out into what had been dubbed the plaza, President Riley took in the breathtaking sight through the glass. The whole civilian population of Rochester had turned out. They lined both sides of the plaza, each one of them waving small flags. The flag of New America had been designed by Riley himself. It was a gold Liberty's torch against a stark black background. The flag was also painted on the sides of his presidential vehicle, a midnight black Mercedes sedan with darkened windows. More impressive even than the 2,000 or so people waving his flag was the army itself. It was in the plaza and ready to march. The 3 black tanks stood on the street like rhinos ready to charge. Behind them the horses and their riders shuffled in place, seemingly eager to be on their way. The line of infantry in their black uniforms snaked down the length of Church Street and out of sight around the corner, their weapons bristling like the spines of a porcupine. 2 armed soldiers stepped through the door before Riley, and the crowd started to cheer. When Riley emerged into the noon sun, the cheers became a roar, the flags fluttering with vigor as he followed the soldiers down to the stretched Mercedes at the foot of the steps. General Orton followed, basking in the glow of what he had helped create and what, if his plans went well, would be his to enjoy as leader, the second president of New America. Bull, also in a black uniform whose buttons strained to contain the heavy muscle of the big man, followed him closely. Aiden Riley waved graciously to the crowd as he walked down the stairs to his car. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and for the first time he thought he had a small sense of the feelings his father must have experienced when he was sworn in or had to speak in front of big crowds. This wasn't the first time he'd been in front of his people, of course, but the last time had been over 2 years ago, and this was a much bigger crowd. Additionally, there was a tangible difference this time. A heightened sense of excitement that was no doubt due to the fact they were marching out to conquest. They'd never assembled an army this big before, never had to, and it definitely seemed to get the juices of the city flowing. Aiden gave a final wave to his adoring crowd. The roar was deafening. He got into the car, buzzing with excitement. Orton slid into the seat beside him while Bull and one of Riley's escorts sat opposite them. The other guard got in the front with the driver. The president sighed and let his head loll back onto the plush headrest. He turned his head and looked at his general. His eyes narrowed. "Nice little plan, William." Orton felt his guts turn to water as a shot of adrenaline went through his body. He eyed the guard opposite him and then looked back at the president. "Plan, sir?" "The march," said Aiden Riley. "And the flags, of course. Everything. Well done." "Thank you, Mr. President," said William, managing to keep the relief from his voice. The walkie-talkie in Orton's pocket crackled. Iron Fist is locked and loaded. Let's move out. The Mercedes moved onto the roadway, easing in between the tanks and the small cavalry. Riley patted Orton on the knee. Here we go. It wasn't long before his excitement would turn to sheer boredom as the reality of the long, slow journey to New Hampshire sunk in. 14. 3 hours later, Daniel Bowman, a former lieutenant of the U.S. Army, began eating the cold can of baked beans he had just opened. He was about 12 miles out of Rochester on a hill overlooking the 490. His partner, a kid called Mel Gunnarsson, was taking some shut-eye in preparation for his turn on watch when the sun went down. Bowman was on his third spoonful of beans when he heard a low, rumbling sound. He stopped chewing, the beans in his mouth suddenly losing their flavor. He grabbed a pair of binoculars from his backpack and crept up behind the boulder that he had been sitting against. He viewed the road 3/4 of a mile away and took the opportunity to chew the beans in his mouth. He focused the binoculars on a clearing between two sets of trees and waited while the rumbling grew louder. Of course, he knew what the sound meant, but a visual would give him confirmation. He swallowed the beans and held his breath. The tank rolled into view, and then another, and then another. They moved slowly and were followed by a black, stretched Mercedes. Then came men on horseback. Bowman counted 100 horses with men on their backs carrying rifles. After the horsemen came infantry, men, and women on foot. They wore black uniforms, and every single one of them held a long gun. Bowman could only estimate the numbers. It took them approximately 10 minutes for the entire column to pass through the gap where he had his binoculars trained. He thought the number was somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 men. Gunnarsson joined him just as the last of the infantry passed. "What's going on?" he asked. "Big trouble." He watched for a while longer to make sure there were no stragglers, then stood up. "Okay, it's on. I want you to grab your bike and head back to Concord as fast as you can go. Take the smaller roads, stay away from the 90. Tell the colonel there are around 3,000 men, all armed plus 3 tanks and cavalry." "What about you?" "I'll head back along the 90. "If they're on the march now, shouldn't we both go back the same way? We haven't been on the 90 at all since we began the surveillance. While it is the fastest way back to Concord, we don't know if it's guarded or being watched. Trust me, it's safer this way. No matter what happens, splitting up means at least one of us should get back in time to warn Randall." "Okay. Now?" Bowman clapped him on the back good-naturedly. "Yes, now, Gunny. Go." Bowman waited until Gunnarsson had packed up his gear and gone before strapping on his own backpack and mounting his Yamaha. Strangely exhilarated, he sped down the mountain. It was a small, single-lane road that led to the 90 just ahead of a little town called Farmington. That would bring him out well ahead of the slow-moving column. Bowman didn't waste any time. Once he turned onto the 90, he gunned the Yamaha and sped east. As he rode, he thought about the briefing that Randall had given him before he left. The reality of the situation was even worse than Randall had imagined. While he was confident in Randall's ability as a general, the sheer size of the army they would be facing was daunting, and while not a pessimist or a coward, Bowman did not see how they could overcome this foe. He wasn't sure if Randall would listen to his counsel, but he would be recommending they retreat to somewhere more defensible than Concord, or even come to some agreement with the New America people. Bowman rode as fast as he dared. While the roads had been cleared of wrecks, there was still the occasional fallen tree or other debris that could bring him down. 40 minutes later, he passed by a little town called Montezuma, barely a third of the way back to Concord. Here, the 90 was a 4-lane highway called the New York State Thruway, the 2 lanes going each direction separated by a large, overgrown median strip. He rounded a bend and slammed on the brakes. Shit. 200 yards ahead was a manned roadblock. There were vehicles and barriers spread right across the thruway and median strip from tree line to tree line. While it had obviously been set up to guard against a threat coming from the opposite direction, Bowman and his bike had caught the attention of the men manning it. Clearly not expecting trouble from the direction of Rochester, they milled around and regarded him with curiosity. One even raised a hand. When he saw another man raise a pair of binoculars, he took his cue to get the hell out and swung the bike around before zooming off with a skid of rubber. Like an ant's nest stirred by a kid with a stick, the men suddenly burst into movement and scrambled for guns and vehicles. The chase was on. At the roadblock, the leader of the small group of new Americans was none other than Dan Eshman. After his punishment, he'd been demoted by Orton and sent to the outposts. Roadblock duty was boring, but Eshman, still in pain from the flogging, passed the time fantasizing about killing Orton in all manner of nasty ways. The punishment meted out to him he could handle. It was, after all, he who had been in command. Orton killing Giuliano in cold blood, though, that aided Eshman, and he couldn't let it go. The kid had made one mistake, and he was killed for it. It proved to him that Orton was a rabid dog, and the only thing to do with a rabid dog was to put it down. He probably would never get the chance, but in the meantime, it seemed like good therapy to mull it over. Eshman had been as curious as the others when the motorcycle came up behind them. They weren't expecting any company until early tomorrow morning, and even then it was supposed to be tanks and troops. Maybe it was a messenger? Then the motorcyclist had made a run for it, and Eshman was buzzing. He sent a Hummer with 4 men to pursue the stranger who was almost certainly a spy. "Try not to kill him. Just capture him," he ordered, not expecting they would have any luck catching the rider. He had too much of a head start. He watched them go and then headed for the command tent. He stalked up to the map and quickly ran his finger along the roads north and south of 90. He judged that it didn't matter which way the bike turned to lose his men. At some point they'd end up back on the 90. It was the quickest way east, and if Eshman was right, the rider was from the group in Concord. On the map, he picked the most likely point to lay a trap, then went to the back of the tent and pulled out the bag that contained his M24 sniper rifle. He left it in the bag and carried it outside. "Johnson, start the Jeep. We're going for a little ride." Somehow, Bowman managed to lose his pursuers. He turned off the thruway and headed into Montezuma. They'd been hot on his tail for a while there, but the bike's ability to get through tight spots in the abandoned town and its speed once he was on the back roads meant that he'd given them the shake. He pulled over and consulted his map as he took a sip of water. He was on a small road northeast of Montezuma and plotted a course that would take him further east and let him merge back onto the 90 about 5 miles past the roadblock. He folded the map and put it away. Before setting off, he tapped the fuel tank with his knuckle. About half a tank left. He knelt and reached under the seat, unclasping the second, he'd already used the first, of the makeshift fuel bottles the professor had fashioned. He quickly set about emptying it into the bike's tank. The bottle didn't fill it up, but he was confident he had enough fuel to make it back to Concord. He set off as the sun was sinking below the horizon. He'd hold off putting the headlight on as long as he could. He made it to the 90 with no drama and paused, looking both ways to ensure there was no unwelcome company in either direction. There wasn't. He gunned the bike and took off towards home. Eshman had only just scrambled onto the roof of the old roadhouse when he heard the buzz of a motorcycle coming from the west. He quickly scrambled to the ridge, staying just below its line, and pulled his always loaded weapon out of its bag. He didn't have time to deploy the tripod, and it wasn't suitable for his position on the roof anyway. With rifle in hand, he edged closer, pausing as the bike got louder. When it was past, he quickly leaned over the edge, resting the barrel on the ridge, and put the scope to his eye, efficiently cocking the bolt as he put his finger on the trigger. As the bike moved away, he smoothly followed it through his scope. One shot only. Make it count. He exhaled and pulled the trigger. Gunnarsson was making good time. He'd also stopped just before dark to consult his map, have some water, and put the last of his spare gas in the tank. He was following the 20. It ran parallel with the 90, but was only 2 lanes and a lot more overgrown and damaged. He'd put his light on and was moving as fast as he dared. About the time Bowman was making his dash away from the roadblock, Gunnarsson crested a hill and looked down on a nice, straight stretch of road. Here the 20 was a dark ribbon lined on either side by thick scrub, and there were no obstacles for as far as the eye could see. Gunnarsson gave it a little more and began to wonder if he could beat Bowman back to Concord. He sped up as he thought of the look on his mentor's face when he arrived to find him already enjoying a cold brewski. He didn't see the deer until it was directly in the beam of his headlight. It was a big buck and appeared from nowhere, walking across the road at a leisurely pace as it headed for the greenery on the other side. He barely had time to touch the brakes before he slammed into the side of the creature. He died instantly, his neck breaking as his head crashed into the ribcage of the big animal. They all went down, man, machine, and animal, in a concussive end to all three. While luck ran out for Gunnarsson, for Bowman it held up. Just as the unseen sniper pulled his trigger, he veered left to avoid a pothole. He saw the spurt of asphalt and dust spray into the air barely 5 feet away and knew he had literally just dodged the bullet. Adrenaline shot through his system, and he twisted the throttle sharply, speeding to get out of range as he veered this way and that to throw off the shooter's aim. He needn't have bothered. Eshman knew he'd only had one shot, and he'd missed it. He wasn't too upset. Not about the shot, anyway. He'd missed it through bad luck, not poor execution. The rider would disappear around the gentle curve in the road ahead before he could get set for a second shot. He was disappointed they lost the rider. If the scout had seen the army leaving Rochester, the Concord people would now have at least a day's warning. He thought he might just keep that fact secret from William Orton when they passed the checkpoint. No sense tempting fate a second time. Besides, forewarned or not, Eshman had no doubt New America would crush Concord if they rejected the president's offer. He had every intention of tagging along with the infantry when they passed. One never knew when an opportunity might present to set some things right. 15. The next day at around 4 in the afternoon, Luke walked down the steps in front of the tower with Indigo and Isaac in tow. He had a fresh haircut and trimmed beard courtesy of Indigo. He wore a white, button-up shirt straight out of its cellophane wrapping and a pair of dark pants. On orders from Indigo and Diana, Isaac and Ben had sourced the clothes on a mission into the heart of Manchester. They'd found a men's clothing store on the main street and had climbed through its broken plate-glass window. There had been plenty of clothes to choose from. Apparently, smart casual apparel wasn't high in the wish list for most post-apocalyptic survivors. Luke was most proud of the gray snakeskin boots Ben had picked and brought back for him.
"They don't really go with the clothes, you know,"
Isaac had said while he was getting dressed and holding out the tan dress shoes he'd picked out.
"You sure you don't want these?"
"Sorry, dude, they're just too sensible,"
he said, zipping up his ankle-high boots.
"These, though, kick ass."
Luke slipped on the aviator glasses he'd found in a desk when they were moving furniture into the storeroom the day before.
"How do I look?"
he asked Isaac and Indigo, holding out his arms while doing a twirl on the heel of his boot. "Very handsome," said Indigo. "I'm sure she'll be very impressed."
"Unless she was really into your shaggy look."
"Ha-ha," said Luke, cuffing Isaac playfully over the ear. Indigo handed him the picnic basket she'd prepared. "It's just some cold cuts of chicken, some bread, grapes, and a bottle of red wine. Hopefully she likes it." He put the basket in the trunk and then hugged Indigo.
"Thanks for my makeover and the picnic basket. You really do rock."
"Well, wish me luck," he said, climbing into the Mustang. Of course, he couldn't resist honking the horn once as he pulled out and thundered down Elm Street towards the checkpoint. The drive to Concord only took 20 minutes, even at a sedate pace. The 93 had been pretty much cleared of all wrecks and debris by Randall's people, so he felt no need to speed. He wanted to preserve as much fuel as he could, anyway. As Jamal had predicted, the guys that had been stationed in Manchester by Randall did not balk at giving him gas for the Mustang. It had only cost him a few joyrides. He was ushered through the gates in Concord with no trouble, but the fuel gauge was getting really low. He would need gas sooner rather than later. Running out of fuel while Becky was in the car was not an option. He kind of hoped she had already gone home for the day. That way he could ask Randall about filling up his tank in return for anything the colonel wanted to name, and then drive to her house, assuming Randall would give him the address. The Mustang drew looks of admiration as he drove it through the neat streets of Concord. Never a shrinking violet, Luke waved and enjoyed the attention he received. Getting out of the car after he pulled up at City Hall, though, he felt unusually nervous. The clean clothes he was wearing weren't as comfortable as his regular jeans and a t-shirt, and the snakeskin boots were about one size too small. He was suddenly worried that Becky would take one look at this new, clean-cut Luke and laugh until she cried. Nothing for it. He took a deep breath and hurried inside. The soldiers and other people he passed greeted him in a friendly manner. He'd become familiar to them, and they were all aware of the fact he and Isaac were in the colonel's good graces. Of course, Becky was still working. As he stepped onto the colonel's floor, he spied her behind the desk and felt a rush of nerves. Her hair was tied back in a simple ponytail, and she wore no makeup. He thought she looked wonderful. Her head was down, and she was busily writing something as he approached. "Hi, Becky," he said simply. Becky looked up, slightly annoyed at the interruption, and stared blankly at him for a few seconds before her eyes widened. "Luke? Hi! Wow, I didn't recognize you." He grinned sheepishly and ran a hand over his newly styled short hair. "Yeah, I got attacked by a lawnmower." She laughed. "I like it. Did you want to see the colonel?" she said, and began to rise from her chair. "No," he said. "Oh?" she said, and slowly sank back down. "I came to see you. I was wondering if you'd like to go for a picnic." "Oh." I mean, only if you want to," he stumbled, suddenly sure he'd misjudged the whole situation. "No, of course. I'd love to. You just took me by surprise is all. Did you mean today? Like, now?" "Yeah," he said, relieved. "I would have called, but, reception is horrible these days." She laughed again and glanced at the clock. "Well, I finish work in 20 minutes. Is that okay? And I'll need to go home and get changed into something more picnic appropriate." "Sure, I'll give you a ride home when you're done. I wanted to ask the colonel about something anyway, so I can kill some time till then." "Perfect. I'll let him know you're here." The colonel saw him right away.
"Of course, my boy. Is this for the Mustang?"
said the colonel. "You know about that?" He patted the walkie-talkie on his desk. "Oh, of course. Yeah, it's a bit of an indulgence, I guess. I'm happy to work for the tank of gas."
"I tell you what, the first one is on me. Drive around, get it out of your system, then maybe only take it out on Sundays. How does that sound?"
"Perfect, thanks."
"Was that all you came for? I hear things are going well in Manchester."
Luke skipped right over the first question. "Yeah, things are great. Thanks to your guys, we have power and water to the tower, and the troops have settled in quietly. We barely know they are there. What about here? No news from the forward team?"
"Nope,"
said the colonel, his face turning serious.
"No news is good news as far as I'm concerned. When we get the word, we'll have about a day's notice to get prepared."
"You have no doubt they'll come east, then?" The colonel shook his head.
"No doubt at all. But we'll cross that bridge when we come to it,"
said the colonel, drilling him with an inquisitor's gaze.
"So, you're not only here for the gas, right?"
"Well, no. I asked Becky out on a date," he said in a quiet voice.
"Sorry, what's that, son? You faded out."
The small twitch at the corner of the colonel's lips told Luke he probably heard exactly what he said. "I asked Becky out on a date," he said loudly.
"Geez, son, no need to shout,"
said the colonel, chuckling heartily. Luke shook his head, helpless not to laugh, too. The old man was seriously enjoying teasing him. Randall looked at his watch.
"Well, the filling station closes in 10 minutes. If you want that tank of gas, you better skedaddle," he said, standing up. "The filling station is on Main Street, an old mobile. Just tell the men I sent you."
"Yes, sir, thanks," said Luke, rising. "Thanks for everything."
"My pleasure,"
said the colonel, putting his hand under Luke's elbow and guiding him to the door. He put his hand on the door handle and leaned into Luke's ear.
"She's a good girl. Make sure you look after her. And no rabble-rousing in that car, you hear?"
"Yes, sir." Colonel Randall nodded, apparently satisfied, and pulled the door open.
"See you soon, son."
As soon as the door was shut, Luke bustled to Becky's desk.
I just have to take care of something. I'll be back to pick you up, okay? Just wait out front."
"Okay," said Becky, surprised at his eagerness to get out of there. 13 minutes later, Luke turned back onto Green Street and put his foot on the gas, roaring up the road as fast as he dared. He slowed abruptly when he saw Becky in the distance. She was standing on the sidewalk and shading her eyes. He pulled up in front of her, left the motor running, and jumped out. "I wondered if you were the revhead," she laughed, as he rounded the front of the car and opened her door for her.
"Revhead? No, that was driving Miss Daisy mode. Do you like it?"
"I do. It's very you." "Why, thank you, kind sir," she said, climbing into the passenger seat. Luke was grinning ear to ear as he ran around and climbed back in behind the wheel.
"So, which way to your place?"
A short time later, they pulled up in front of a neat little bungalow with white cladding, a red roof, and a well-trimmed lawn.
"Your place?"
he asked. "Yes, it's all mine. It's tiny, but perfect for me."
"It's really nice. Very you,"
he said. "Thanks. Come in." They got out, and she led him up the path to the front door. It wasn't locked.
"No crime?"
he asked, as she ushered him into the short hallway. "A little bit, and it will probably get worse as we get bigger," she shrugged. "I figure if someone is desperate enough to steal any of my meager possessions, they probably need them more than me."
"That's very altruistic of you," he said, pausing as she closed the door.
"Ooh, nice word." Luke laughed.
"Yeah, I've been waiting for a chance to use it on a pretty girl."
They looked at each other awkwardly in the tight space before she squeezed past him. "I'm flattered it was me. Would you like a drink?"
"Yes, please."
He followed her into the kitchen and took a seat at the breakfast bar as she poured him cold water from the refrigerator. "Don't drink it too fast. I'll go and get changed."
"Okay, small sips only."
Luke watched her go, a goofy smile on his lips. The whole afternoon seemed a bit surreal. 16. Luke took Becky a little south of Concord for their picnic, to a nice spot on the Merrimack that he'd spotted months ago when he began his trek to the coast. They'd already eaten the chicken and bread Indigo had packed for them, and were now sitting quietly next to each other, eating grapes and working on their second glass of wine each. "I'm so full," said Becky, putting a hand on her stomach. "That was delicious." Luke thought she looked just beautiful. Her long, dark hair fell in soft waves over the shoulder of the white cashmere sweater she was wearing, and her cheeks were a little pink from the alcohol.
"It was. And so's the company," said Luke.
She giggled and looked at him sidelong. "Were you always such a smooth talker?" He shrugged.
"I was always a talker. Not sure about smooth."
"Oh, you're smooth." She shuffled closer and leaned against him. Still fearing rejection, he put his arm around her shoulder tentatively. As cocky as he was, Luke didn't really have much experience with girls. His relationship with Brooke had developed from a solid friendship, and there had been none of the usual dating or courtship angst. This was much different. He was nervous and didn't really know how to proceed. "What's wrong?" Becky asked, turning to look at him. "You've gone all quiet."
"Nothing. I was just—"
She leaned in and kissed him tenderly on the lips. Stunned, he wasn't quick enough to respond before she drew away, smiling. "This is where you kiss me back." She leaned in again. Luke kissed her back this time. They took it slowly. Luke was a gentleman, but Becky also sensed that she shouldn't push things too quickly. They spent some more time talking and laughing as they finished the grapes. When the sun was low on the horizon, Luke said,
"Well, I better get you home. I don't want the colonel coming after me with a six-shooter."
She giggled. "He's just a big teddy bear," she said.
"Grizzly bear, you mean?"
"Teddy. Just don't get on his wrong side."
"Well, I don't plan to," he said, rolling up the blanket and taking it to the trunk.
20 minutes later, he pulled up in front of Becky's little home. "Did you want to come in for a coffee?" Luke was more than just interested in Becky, But years of old James Stewart movies and his dad's lessons about how to act like a gentleman meant there was no way he would... "Just for coffee, Luke," she said, grinning at his conflicted face. "Okay, yeah, sure. I'd love to." 2 hours, 3 coffees, lots of chat, and more than a few kisses later, Luke finally yawned. "I really should get going." "Don't get any ideas," she teased. "But you should stay the night, on the sofa." "No, it's all right. It's not too far to drive," he said, standing up. She grasped his arm. "Please, it would make me feel better. Otherwise I'll be worried all night. I'll let you go first thing, I promise." "I suppose so. But aren't you worried about what people will think?" "People will think what they want to think anyway. At least you and I know that I didn't let you have your wicked way with me." She stood on tiptoes to kiss him lingeringly. "You talked me into it." "Good," she said, suddenly all business. "I'll get you a pillow and some sheets." 10 minutes later, Luke was lying on the sofa staring at the darkened ceiling, exceedingly happy but wide awake. His mind roiled with the possibilities of new love. It took him a long time to get to sleep.